Professor Zixtal, I must respectfully disagree with your assessment. These data points simply cannot be correct, chittered senior medical student Valthan, their crystalline appendages trembling with academic fervor. No species could possibly survive such extensive physical trauma and continue functioning. The distinguished xenobiologist adjusted her sensor arrays, compound eyes refracting the harsh laboratory illumination. And yet, student Valthan, the evidence stands before us. Would you care to present your objections to our guest lecturer? All 6 of Valthan's eyestalks swiveled toward the front of the lecture chamber, where a remarkably unremarkable bipedal figure stood with casual poise that seemed to defy the gravity settings of the Galactic Medical Academy's primary teaching facility. Dr. Sarah Chen, visiting professor of human medical sciences, smiled that peculiar lip-stretching expression her species was known for. Please, share your concerns. I find student skepticism often leads to the most illuminating discussions. Valthan's crystalline exoskeleton clicked as they straightened to their full height, a gesture of academic challenge that dated back to the founding of their species' first universities. Very well. According to these case studies, a human adolescent survived falling from a height of 3,000 meters when their atmospheric descent device failed. Another human continued to function for 6 hours with a metal rod completely transfixing their cranial cavity. And this one. Their voice took on the harmonic overtones of profound distress. This human lost approximately 40% of their total blood volume and simply walked to a medical facility? Yes. Dr. Chen nodded, bringing up the relevant holographic displays. The skydiving incident in New Zealand 2025, the construction accident in Pennsylvania 1848, and the farming accident in rural Montana 2018. All well-documented cases in our medical literature. But it defies everything we know about biological systems. Valthan's crystalline surface was practically vibrating with intellectual agitation. The trauma alone should have induced immediate systemic shutdown. The blood loss should have caused irreversible organ failure. The neurological damage should have been catastrophic. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in what the more experienced xenobiologists in the room recognized as barely suppressed amusement. She had seen this reaction before. It was practically a rite of passage for senior medical students specializing in xenobiology. Dr. Chen's smile widened slightly. Perhaps this would be a good time to discuss human evolutionary history and why we're considerably harder to kill than most species might expect. She gestured, and the holographic display shifted to show the savannas of ancient Earth. Imagine, if you will, a species that evolved not through superior strength, speed, or defensive capabilities, but through sheer, stubborn persistence. The human professor began to pace, her movements displaying the unconscious efficiency of a predator species that had most of the alien students instinctively shifting their sensory organs to tracking mode. Humans evolved as persistence hunters. Before we developed tools, before we mastered fire, we killed our prey by simply following it. Hour after hour, day after day, maintaining pursuit until the target collapsed from exhaustion. This required several unique adaptations: efficient bipedal locomotion, superior thermoregulation through sweating, and most importantly, robust redundancy in all critical systems. The display shifted to show human anatomical diagrams. Valthan's eye stalks writhed in fascination. We can lose significant amounts of blood because our cardiovascular system can rapidly redistribute flow to critical organs. We can survive massive trauma because our bodies are essentially over-engineered, with backup systems for backup systems. And our neural architecture? It's so densely networked that we can lose substantial portions of our brain and still maintain functionality through neuroplasticity. Professor Zixtal raised a primary appendage. Perhaps you could share the incident from your own residency. I believe it would be particularly instructive. Yes. Dr. Chen's expression shifted to what the alien students were learning to recognize as nostalgic amusement. The construction worker who arrived in the emergency department with a pneumatic nail gun injury. He had accidentally discharged 16 nails into his own skull. A ripple of horrified harmonic frequencies swept through the lecture chamber. Several students' chromatophores shifted to the pale hues of medical distress. He was conscious, oriented, and primarily concerned about missing his shift. He had driven himself to the hospital because he didn't want to bother anyone. We removed all 16 nails, and he was back at work within 2 weeks. Valthan's crystalline surface had taken on a faintly nauseated iridescence. But how? Luck in nail placement, certainly, Dr. Chen acknowledged, but also that fundamental human durability. We're essentially the biological equivalent of emergency systems with triple redundancy. It's not that we're particularly hard to damage. We're just extraordinarily difficult to shut down completely. She brought up another series of case studies. Consider our skeletal structure. Most species, when subjected to sufficient force, experience catastrophic structural failure. Human bones, however, tend to crack and splinter rather than shatter. This often allows us to continue functioning even with significant fractures. We call it walking wounded. Humans with multiple bone breaks who nevertheless remain ambulatory and conscious. Is this why human medical facilities maintain such extensive safety protocols? Asked another student, their bioluminescent patches pulsing with curiosity. Partially, Dr. Chen nodded. But it's also because humans tend to respond to injury in ways that other species find concerning. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in what might have been a chuckle. Perhaps you should tell them about the emergency department betting pools. Dr. Chen's expression shifted to what the alien students were beginning to recognize as embarrassed amusement. Ah yes, it's not officially sanctioned, of course, but most human emergency departments have informal wagers on what seemingly fatal injury will next walk through the door complaining of minor discomfort. She brought up another case file. Like this gentleman who arrived under his own power complaining of a bit of a headache after a high-speed vehicle collision. He had bilateral skull fractures and was actively leaking cerebrospinal fluid from both ears. He wanted to know if we could give him something for the pain so he could return to work. Valthan's eyestalks had begun to droop in what appeared to be cognitive overload. But why continue functioning? Surely the appropriate response to such trauma would be to enter protective shutdown. Ah, Dr. Chen's expression brightened. That brings us to perhaps the most fascinating aspect of human physiology, our stress response system. While most species have evolved to minimize damage through protective shutdown, humans have developed what we call the fight or flight response. When severely injured, we don't shut down, we speed up. The holographic display shifted to show human endocrine and nervous systems. Adrenaline, norepinephrine, cortisol. A cocktail of hormones that essentially tells our bodies to ignore damage and keep functioning at all costs. It's a survival mechanism that evolved from our persistence hunter days, but it means that humans often don't realize how severely they're injured until well after the fact. This cannot be evolutionarily advantageous, protested Valthan. Continuing to function while damaged would only exacerbate injuries. In most cases you'd be correct, Dr. Chen acknowledged. But remember, humans evolved in an environment where the difference between life and death was often measured in minutes or seconds. The ability to continue functioning despite severe injury meant the difference between reaching safety and becoming prey. She brought up another case file. Consider this rancher who, after being partially crushed by a piece of heavy equipment, set his own broken leg, splinted it with fence posts and baling wire, then drove himself 40 kilometers to the nearest medical facility. By any reasonable medical standard, he should have been in shock and unconscious. Instead, he was primarily concerned about getting back to finish his work before sunset. The lecture chamber had grown very quiet, filled only with the soft hum of life support systems and the occasional click of recording devices. This is why human medical training includes such extensive sections on patient assessment, Dr. Chen continued. We cannot rely on patient-reported pain levels or obvious signs of distress. A human claiming they are fine may have multiple life-threatening injuries. Conversely, a human screaming in apparent agony may have nothing more serious than a minor joint sprain. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in agreement, which brings us to perhaps the most important lesson for future xenobiologists. Never assume a human is incapacitated merely because they have sustained what would be fatal injuries in other species. Precisely, Dr. Chen nodded. We had a saying in my emergency department. The patient isn't dead until they're warm and dead. Humans have been documented surviving core temperature drops that would cause immediate cellular death in most species. We've had cases of drowning victims being successfully resuscitated after more than an hour underwater in cold conditions. The current record holder for survival after cardiac arrest is 3 hours and 45 minutes. Valthan's crystalline surface had taken on a distinct stress fracture pattern. Professor, are you suggesting that humans are effectively immortal? Dr. Chen laughed, a sound that still caused some of the more sensitive students to flinch. Oh, not at all. We die quite readily from all sorts of things. The difference is that we rarely die quickly or predictably. Human medical facilities have entire protocols built around the fact that we can appear perfectly fine right up until catastrophic system failure, or appear obviously dead only to make a full recovery. She brought up one final case file. Like this memorable incident from my residency. A hunter found 3 days after being caught in a blizzard. Core temperature so low it didn't register on standard medical equipment. No detectable cardiac activity. Fixed, dilated pupils. By every standard medical criterion, he had been dead for hours. The human professor's expression took on that peculiar configuration that the alien students were learning to associate with professional pride. He made a full recovery and was discharged 2 weeks later. His only complaint was that he had lost his favorite hat in the storm. The lecture chamber erupted in a cacophony of different species versions of surprised exclamation. Professor Zixtal raised several appendages for silence. And this, students, is why the Galactic Medical Council has officially classified humans as medically unpredictable and requires all xenobiological facilities to maintain specific human-rated equipment and protocols. Their ability to survive what should be unsurvivable makes them fascinating subjects for medical study and extraordinarily challenging patients. Valthan's eyestalks had begun to recover their usual rigid posture of academic intensity. But surely there must be some way to predict. "Oh, there is," Dr. Chen interrupted, her expression shifting to what the aliens were beginning to recognize as professional mischief. "When treating human patients, there is one absolutely reliable diagnostic criterion. The more a human insists they are perfectly fine and don't need medical attention, the more likely they are to be critically injured." She brought up one final holographic image. A human male sitting calmly in what was clearly an emergency department, reading something on a data device while a metal beam completely transfixed his thoracic cavity. This gentleman insisted he just needed a bandage and tried to refuse treatment because he had to get back to work. He had missed his heart by approximately 2 millimeters. The human professor's expression softened into something the alien students couldn't quite categorize. "We're not immortal, we're not invincible, and we're certainly not immune to injury. We've simply evolved to be very, very bad at staying down when we're hurt. It makes us terrible patients, but excellent survivors." Valthan's crystalline surface had finally settled into its normal academic sheen. "I believe I understand now, Professor. Humans are not exceptional because they cannot be killed, but because they refuse to acknowledge when they should be dead." "Precisely," Dr. Chen beamed, though I prefer to think of it as evolutionarily optimistic. "Now, shall we move on to discussing appropriate safety protocols when treating human patients? I have some particularly interesting case studies about humans and their remarkable ability to generate impromptu weapons from standard medical equipment." The lecture chamber filled with the sounds of multiple species recording devices activating simultaneously. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in satisfied amusement. Another class of xenobiological medical students was about to learn why human medical facilities had such extensively reinforced safety protocols, and why human-rated had become galactic medical shorthand for practically indestructible. Dr. Chen's smile took on that peculiar predatory edge that her species had never quite lost, despite millennia of civilization. "Now, who would like to hear about the time a human patient insisted on completing their physical therapy session, despite having technically been dead for the past 20 minutes? Valthan's eyestalks drooped again. It was going to be a very long semester. "Today's lecture," Dr. Chen announced to the packed amphitheater, "will focus on perhaps the most perplexing aspect of human medical care. Our seemingly paradoxical response to chemical substances and environmental conditions." Valthan, now sporting several new crystalline growths that marked their advancement in xenobiological studies, adjusted their recording apparatus with practiced efficiency. The last semester had taught them to document everything about human physiology, no matter how improbable it might seem. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in anticipation. "Dr. Chen, perhaps you could address the recent incident from the Proxima Centauri mining colony. I believe it would provide an excellent starting point for today's discussion." "Ah, yes." Dr. Chen's expression shifted to what the class had learned to recognize as professionally amused resignation. "The case of the maintenance technician who accidentally ingested industrial coolant." The holographic display activated, showing chemical formulae that caused several students' sensory organs to recoil in instinctive horror. By any reasonable chemical analysis, the substance should have caused immediate and catastrophic cellular breakdown, Dr. Chen continued. Instead, the technician finished his shift, completed his incident report, and then mentioned to the medical officer that his coffee had tasted a bit off. Valthan's eye stalks writhed in familiar academic distress. "But the molecular structure alone would dissolve most organic compounds on contact," Dr. Chen nodded. "And yet, thanks to what we call the human hepatic override system, our technician survived with nothing more serious than a remarkable hangover and some interesting temporary alterations to his urine's fluorescent properties. She gestured, and the display shifted to show human liver anatomy. You see, human bodies evolved alongside some of the most biochemically aggressive plant life in the known galaxy. Earth's flora developed increasingly complex toxins. Humans developed increasingly sophisticated detoxification systems. It's essentially an evolutionary arms race that never quite ended. This explains the extensive warnings in human medical facilities about self-medicating patients, chittered a new student, their bioluminescent patches pulsing with curiosity. Precisely. Dr. Chen's smile took on a distinctly predatory edge. Humans have an almost pathological tendency to experiment with substances that should, by any reasonable biological standard, be immediately fatal. We've documented cases of humans deliberately consuming everything from highly radioactive materials to neurotoxic amphibian secretions, often for what they term recreational purposes. The lecture chamber filled with the harmonic frequencies of multiple species expressing simultaneous medical distress. But surely, Valthan's crystalline surface flickered with academic intensity. There must be limits to this chemical resilience. Oh, absolutely, Dr. Chen agreed. The challenge lies in predicting those limits for any given individual. Human genetic diversity means that what's lethal for one person might be merely unpleasant for another, and what's therapeutic for a third might be completely ineffective for a fourth. She brought up another case file. Consider this incident from the Mars colonies. A worker accidentally exposed to an atmospheric processor's worth of industrial stimulants, enough caffeine to stop the hearts of an entire herd of Earth elephants. Their only complaint was that they couldn't sleep for 3 days and completed an entire month's worth of maintenance tasks in one shift. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in what might have been suppressed laughter. Perhaps you should tell them about the standard human morning ritual? Yes. Dr. Chen's expression shifted to something the alien students had learned to recognize as cultural pride. Most humans begin their day by deliberately consuming doses of caffeine that would be considered lethal neurotoxins by roughly 60% of Galactic Council species. We do this so routinely that we've developed entire cultural ceremonies around it. The holographic display showed various coffee preparation methods, causing several students to emit distress pheromones. But this chemical resilience extends far beyond mere stimulants, Dr. Chen continued. Humans have evolved the ability to metabolize substances that most species would consider weapons-grade oxidizers. We not only survive in oxygen-rich atmospheres, we require them to function optimally. She brought up comparative atmospheric analysis charts. What most species consider corrosive levels of oxygen, we consider a nice day at the beach. We've documented cases of humans surviving in atmospheric conditions that would trigger immediate molecular breakdown in most carbon-based life forms. Valthan's eyestalks had begun to show the slight tremors that their classmates now recognized as the prelude to another fundamental questioning of established xenobiological principles. Are you suggesting, they chittered carefully, that humans are essentially walking biohazards? From a certain perspective, yes. Dr. Chen nodded. Human breath alone contains enough oxidizing agents to damage sensitive equipment. Our normal body chemistry would be considered toxic waste on many worlds, and don't even get me started on our digestive systems. The display shifted to show human gastrointestinal anatomy, causing several students to quickly adjust their visual receptors. Humans are one of the few known species that can not only survive but thrive while hosting billions of microorganisms inside our bodies. Our digestive system is essentially a carefully maintained ecosystem of what other species would consider extremely dangerous bacteria. She highlighted several areas of the diagram. We've evolved to be so dependent on these internal microbiomes that we actually become ill if they're disrupted. This is why human medical facilities maintain such strict protocols about antimicrobial treatments. We have to be careful not to kill the wrong bacteria. But how do you determine which potentially lethal microorganisms are beneficial? Asked a student whose species reproduced through sporulation and found the whole concept of internal bacteria deeply disturbing. That's where it gets really interesting. Dr. Chen's expression brightened with academic enthusiasm. Human medical science is still discovering new aspects of our microbiome. We're essentially walking chemistry experiments that have achieved a remarkable state of dynamic equilibrium. She brought up another case file, like this incident from the Europa Research Station. A programmer consumed a meal contaminated with what should have been lethal levels of bacterial toxins. Instead of dying, they developed a temporary ability to digest cellulose, Their only complaint was that their favorite snacks didn't taste right for a few weeks. Valthan's crystalline surface had taken on the iridescent patterns that indicated deep academic confusion. Professor, are you suggesting that humans can spontaneously develop new digestive capabilities? Under the right circumstances, yes. Dr. Chen nodded. Our gut bacteria are remarkably adaptable, and horizontal gene transfer is more common than we once thought. We've documented cases of humans developing temporary resistance to various toxins simply through gradual exposure. The display shifted to show various chemical warning symbols. This is why human medical facilities maintain such extensive databases of individual patient reactions. What might be lethal to one human could be ineffective for another, and what works as medicine today might have no effect tomorrow. Is this why human medical predictions seem so... A student paused, searching for a diplomatically appropriate term. Vague? Dr. Chen supplied helpfully. Absolutely. We've learned through long experience that the only truly reliable prediction about human biochemical responses is that they will be unpredictable. She brought up one final case file. Consider this classic example from medical literature. A human who, through gradual exposure, developed such high tolerance to normally lethal compounds that standard medications became completely ineffective. The solution? Their medical team had to develop entirely new treatment protocols based on substances that would be considered chemical weapons on most worlds. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in academic appreciation. And this is why the Galactic Medical Council requires all xenobiological facilities to maintain separate human-rated chemical containment systems. Precisely. Dr. Chen agreed. What most species consider hazardous waste disposal units, we consider standard human medical waste management. Our normal metabolic byproducts would trigger biohazard alerts on most worlds. Valthan's eyestalks had finally achieved the rigid posture of academic revelation. I believe I understand now, Professor. Humans are not exceptional because they can survive toxic substances, but because they have evolved to treat what should be lethal compounds as routine metabolic challenges. Dr. Chen beamed, though I prefer to think of it as biochemical optimism. Now, shall we move on to discussing human dietary habits? I have some fascinating case studies about humans and their remarkable ability to derive nutrition from substances that most species would consider industrial solvents. The lecture chamber filled with the now familiar sounds of multiple species recording devices activating simultaneously, accompanied by the soft hum of emergency ventilation systems cycling up to full power. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in anticipation of another fascinating session of watching medical students learn why human quarantine protocols were considered unnecessarily mild by human standards and terrifyingly inadequate by everyone else's. Dr. Chen's smile took on that particular edge that reminded her alien colleagues of Earth's apex predators. Now, who would like to hear about the time a human mining crew survived 6 months on a diet that technically qualified as low-grade rocket fuel? Valthan's eyestalks drooped in resignation. They were going to need to upgrade their recording equipment again. Today's session, Dr. Chen announced, activating the lecture hall's enhanced containment fields, will address what the Galactic Medical Council has termed human psychological resilience, or what we humans simply call spite. Valthan's crystalline surface rippled with anticipation. Their previous lectures had covered physical and chemical resilience. Surely psychological aspects couldn't be equally unsettling. Professor Zixtal's mandibles arranged themselves into what her more experienced students recognized as her "you're about to have your fundamental assumptions challenged" configuration. Let's begin with a recent case from the Kuiper Belt mining operations, Dr. Chen said, bringing up a holographic display. A human maintenance technician became trapped in a sealed compartment during a pressure failure. Standard emergency protocols predicted death within 4 hours due to oxygen depletion. She paused, allowing her expression to shift to what the class now recognized as professional bemusement. The technician survived for 26 hours by manually cycling the emergency air scrubbers, maintaining consciousness through what they later described as pure spite because, and I quote, that overpaid supervisor said the scrubbers couldn't be manually cycled. Valthan's eyestalks writhed in confusion. Are you suggesting that human survival capabilities can be enhanced by emotional defiance? Precisely. Dr. Chen nodded. Human medical literature is filled with cases where patients survived seemingly unsurvivable conditions through what we technically term psychological override of physiological limitations, but what most human medical professionals colloquially call angry persistence. The display shifted to show human neurological scans. Under normal circumstances, human bodies have multiple systems designed to shut down when faced with extreme conditions. Pain responses, fatigue, even consciousness itself. All these can be overridden by sufficient psychological motivation. But surely, chittered a student whose species reproduced through binary fission, such override capabilities would cause severe systemic damage. Oh, absolutely, Dr. Chen agreed. Human medical facilities maintain extensive protocols for dealing with what we call post-adrenaline crash, the inevitable systemic consequences of forcing our bodies to continue functioning beyond normal limitations. The fascinating part is how often humans consider this damage an acceptable trade-off for proving someone else wrong. She brought up another case file. Consider this incident from the Mars colonies. A human geologist was informed by their colleague that it would be impossible to collect samples from a particular crater due to extreme environmental conditions. The geologist proceeded to spend 14 hours in conditions that should have induced hypothermia, collected twice the required samples, and only sought medical attention after carefully labeling and cataloging each specimen. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Perhaps you should share the incident from the Europa Research Station? Ah, yes. Dr. Chen's expression took on that peculiar configuration that the alien students had learned to associate with proud exasperation. A human researcher was told that their experimental protocol was unnecessarily complex. They proceeded to work for 72 hours straight, subsisting entirely on emergency ration bars and synthetic caffeine, to prove that their method was superior. They succeeded, by the way, though they required 3 days of medical observation afterward. The lecture hall filled with the harmonic frequencies of multiple species expressing simultaneous confusion. But this extends beyond mere academic rivalry, Dr. Chen continued. Human medical facilities have documented countless cases where patients survived seemingly fatal conditions through what we can only describe as psychological resistance to death itself. She brought up another series of case studies, like this deep space incident where a maintenance worker, after being informed that rescue would be impossible for at least 12 hours, survived in a damaged suit by manually regulating their breathing to conserve oxygen. When asked how they managed this physiologically impossible feat, they stated they refused to give their ex-spouse the satisfaction of being right about spacework being too dangerous. Valthan's crystalline surface had begun to display stress fracture patterns. Professor, are you suggesting that human survival rates can be influenced by personal grudges? More often than you might think, Dr. Chen nodded. We've documented numerous cases where patients survived against all medical probability, apparently motivated by what they termed unfinished business. This can range from family obligations to professional competitions to, in one memorable case, a patient who refused to die because they hadn't finished reading the last book in their favorite series. The display shifted to show comparative psychological profiles. Most species have evolved sophisticated survival instincts based on rational assessment of threats and resources. Humans, however, appear to have developed what we call competitive survival, the ability to continue functioning through seemingly unsurvivable conditions primarily motivated by the desire to prove others wrong. This cannot be evolutionarily advantageous, protested a student whose species achieved consciousness through collective neural networking. By conventional evolutionary standards, you're absolutely correct, Dr. Chen agreed. And yet, human medical history is filled with cases where this seemingly irrational psychological trait has resulted in survival against overwhelming odds. She brought up another case file. Take this classic example from our archives. A human explorer, after being told that crossing a particular desert on foot was impossible, not only completed the crossing but documented 3 new species and wrote a detailed critique of their critics' methodology along the way. They arrived at their destination severely dehydrated, suffering from multiple environmental injuries, but with their research notes meticulously organized. Professor Zixtal's mandibles arranged themselves into what might have been a smile. And this is why human medical facilities maintain such extensive psychological monitoring protocols? Exactly, Dr. Chen confirmed. We've learned through experience that human patients are most dangerous, both to themselves and to medical equipment, when they've been told something is impossible. The more emphatically you tell a human they cannot or should not do something, the more likely they are to attempt it out of sheer psychological resistance. She brought up one final holographic image. A human patient attempting to complete physical therapy exercises while technically in cardiac arrest. This gentleman insisted on finishing his rehabilitation session because, and I quote, That smug physical therapist said I wouldn't be walking for 6 months. He completed the full routine, set a new recovery record, and only then allowed us to address the minor issue of his heart having temporarily stopped. Valthen's eyestalks had achieved a new configuration that their classmates didn't recognize. Professor, are you suggesting that human psychological resilience is actually more significant than their physical adaptations? In many cases, yes. Dr. Chen's expression shifted to what the class had learned to recognize as professional pride. While our bodies are remarkably durable, it's our psychological ability to simply refuse to accept limitations that truly sets us apart. We don't survive because we're physically superior. We survive because we're too stubborn to die when we're supposed to. The lecture hall had grown very quiet, filled only with the soft hum of recording devices and the occasional click of crystalline appendages adjusting in academic discomfort. This is why, Dr. Chen continued, the Galactic Medical Council now requires all xenobiological facilities to incorporate psychological factors in their human treatment protocols. It's not enough to understand human physical and chemical resilience. You must also account for their remarkable ability to ignore physiological limitations through sheer force of will. She brought up one final case study. Consider this recent incident from the Alpha Centauri research station. A human technician, after being informed that their proposed maintenance procedure was unnecessarily elaborate, proceeded to complete a 30-hour repair sequence in null gravity conditions while suffering from a mild concussion. When asked why they didn't wait for medical clearance, they replied that they had a point to prove. Valthen's crystalline surface had finally settled into a new pattern that seemed to indicate academic resignation. I believe I understand now, Professor. Humans are not exceptional because they cannot be killed, but because they often simply refuse to acknowledge that they should be dead. Excellent observation, Dr. Chen beamed, though I prefer to think of it as motivational immortality. Now shall we move on to discussing appropriate protocols for handling human patients who have been told something is impossible? I have some particularly interesting case studies about humans and their remarkable ability to achieve medical miracles purely out of spite. The lecture hall filled with the sounds of multiple species recording devices activating simultaneously, accompanied by the soft hum of psychological monitoring equipment cycling up to full power. Professor Zixtal's mandibles clicked in anticipation of another fascinating session of watching medical students learn why human determination was considered a Class 3 hazard in most medical facilities. Dr. Chen's smile took on that particular edge that reminded her alien colleagues why humans had been classified as psychologically unpredictable by the Galactic Medical Council. Now, who would like to hear about the time a human patient rejected approved treatment protocols and cured their condition through what they described as aggressive optimism and recreational biochemistry? Valthen's eyestalks drooped in what might have been defeat. They were going to need to upgrade their psychological shielding again.